and I'm taking this handheld microphone. Good morning and welcome to today's special lecture and webcast here in Portland, Oregon. And good very early morning to Hawaii, and good day, good afternoon, good evening to our global audience who can view this event live now. My name is Patrick Hiller. I'm the director of the War Prevention Initiative by the Jubitz Family Foundation, and I also teach conflict resolution here at Portland State University. On behalf of the War Prevention Initiative by the Jubitz Family Foundation, I would like to welcome you, and on behalf of the Rotarian Action Group for Peace, and on behalf of Portland State's Conflict Resolution Program, we welcome you to this special lecture, Structurally Transforming Militarism for Peace, by activist, researcher, and author John Lindsay Poland. One of the War Prevention Initiative's areas of focus is to support the development of effective strategies to convince Americans that the United States should not promote war, militarism, or weapons proliferation, but rather embrace conflict resolution practices that have been shown to prevent, shorten, or eliminate war as viable alternatives to local, regional, and global conflicts. Let me put it this way. We are at a stage in human history where we can say with confidence that we know better and more effective alternatives to war and violence. One of the biggest obstacles is our own and the global culture of militarism. That is a society in which war or preparation for war dominates politics and foreign policy. Our own work at the War Prevention Initiative focuses on helping create and tell the alternative story of a global peace system. That is a system where numerous undeniable trends in the areas of constructive conflict transformation, social change, and global collaboration show that humans are already experimenting and practicing alternatives to war and violence. Those positive trends are, for example, the development of human rights, women's rights, LGBT rights, the decline of capital punishment, peaceful religious initiatives, environmentalism, peace education, peace activism, nonviolent struggle, peace journalism, non-governmental organizations like Rotary International, professional peace building, international law and treaties, or supranational organizations. Now that's the good story. That's the one that gives us hope that we can indeed achieve a world beyond war. At the same time, there are some undeniable, unavoidable, game-changing factors. We need to address our planetary crisis, shift the global economic system, repurpose the military-industrial security, add your own complex, reform the system of international governments, and confront militarism. We simply cannot move forward without recognizing the need to structurally transform militarism for peace. So this is the context of today's presentation. We welcome our global audiences who we have invited through our organizational personal networks. So we hope that we have some viewers from our partner organizations, the Alliance for Peace Building, Peace and Security Funders Group, the Peace and Justice Studies Association, World Beyond War, and other networks of nonviolent activists and other international peace research institutions. One element we recognized in the War Prevention Initiative is the power of convening. We see a great opportunity to further peace-building efforts by bringing together likely and unlikely allies. We hope that an event like this, one today, will spark thoughts for collaboration and projects to bring us closer to our vision of a world beyond war. And we'd also like to thank Al and Ray Jubitz from the Jubitz Family Foundation for supporting not only this event, but for their active involvement in peace-building efforts in all sectors of society. We also would like to thank Rob Gould, the chair of the Conflict Resolution Program at Portland State University, for co-hosting. And of course, the entire core team of our War Prevention Initiative, which is here, which is working quietly behind the scenes. And I'd like to turn it over to Aaron Thomas now, who is the director of the Rotarian Action Group for Peace, one of the co-hosts of this event.
Good morning. Thank you for being here today. Again, my name is Erin Thomas, and I am the Executive Director of the Rotarian Action Group for Peace. I wanted to start by telling you a little bit about how Rotary is involved in peace building worldwide. The story goes back to Rotary's inception. Rotary has always been working for a world beyond war. But my story will start in the 1980s. In the 1980s, Rotary was ahead of its time when it decided that it wanted to create a program to bring together people, students, professionals working in the field of peace and conflict resolution to get master's degrees and certificates of professional training in this field. In the 1980s, they looked around the world and they tried to find universities to partner with. And the field was just beginning. There weren't enough quality programs all around the world, not just the Western world, not just the United States. These programs were to be on every continent. And they looked around and it wasn't quite time. Fast forward to 2003, they opened their first 7 Rotary Peace Centers all over the globe. Each year, students, over 100 students from all over the world, people who have already worked in the field of nonprofit management and have worked in refugee camps, have worked in building peace in myriad ways, come together to receive master's degrees or certificates in conflict resolution. This network, as of this summer, will be 1,000 strong, 1,000 more people who are equipped to go further and faster in developing the programs that can change our world. And it's a really interesting thing that Rotary decided to invest in that. At the time, their main community service work globally was polio. In 2013, they refocused all of their national and international community service work to 6 areas of focus. The first of those areas of focus is peace. And they know well that the other 5 areas of focus feed into that first area of focus. Without a peaceful society, there cannot be an ending to hunger, an ending to illiteracy, and the other things that plague our world. And so Rotary has made a very deep investment in this. We founded the Rotarian Action Group for Peace, a group of Rotarians and Rotary Peace Fellows working together globally to further these programs that Rotary is developing on the ground through Rotarians, Rotary clubs, and global Rotary collaborations. We're really excited to hear from John today because it's exactly what we need to do. We need to be involved, Rotary and all other NGOs, in changing the structure of the way we approach our society. And so I'm really excited to hear from John today, and I'm going to hand the microphone back to Patrick, who will tell us a little bit more about John's work and what we hope to learn today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It is time now to introduce our main speaker. John Lindsay Polin is a writer, activist, researcher, and analyst focused on human rights and demilitarization, especially in Latin America. He has written about, researched, and organized action for human rights and demilitarization of U.S. policy in Latin America for 30 years. From 1989 to 2014, he served the Interfaith Pacifist Organization Fellowship of Reconciliation as coordinator of the Task Force on Latin America and the Caribbean, as research director, and founded FOR's Colombia Peace Team. From 2003 to 2014, he edited a monthly newsletter focused on Colombia and U.S. policy called Latin America Update. He participated in the 2012 U.S.-Mexico Caravan for Peace. We actually ran into each other there. And has visited Ciudad Juarez 4 times as part of FOR's work to address gun trafficking and the U.S. role in violence in Mexico. Previously, he served with Peace Brigades International, PBI, in Guatemala and El Salvador, and co-founded PBI's Colombia project in 1994. Now, this is the official bio. I want to add a few more words about John based on what I think I know about him. A metaphor for John's life work could be proof for peace and justice. John's strong orientation toward researching social issues supports his activist causes. His research is based on exploration and experiments, as well as on rather academic methodological approaches, which he disseminates in his writings, and we have literature here of John's writings. John's inquisitive nature was not satisfied at the Ivy League institution he attended. The structures there were holding him back from exploring on his own, studying issues for himself, and acting reflectively. In essence, John became the creator of his own knowledge and pathway without experiencing it through the privileged lens of Ivy League education. This is what I've come to appreciate and admire over the course of the last years, and I'm grateful he's here to speak to us today.
Thank you so much. And thank you, those of you who are here this morning and who are online. Thanks so much to Ray and Al Jubitz and to the War Prevention Initiative and Rotarian Action Group for Peace, as well as PSU for hosting this event. And to Patrick, thank you so much for also putting this together. I want to talk a bit today, give you some material about militarism, particularly U.S. militarism, about responses to militarism. And during the presentation, I am going to ask you some questions and hope for your responses and what your thinking is. And then when we're done with the presentation, I hope we can have some conversation and some questions and responses. So I realized at some point, I'm not exactly sure when I realized that, and I'm saying this because of what we're going to talk about today, that militarism is it's toxic to us. Now, it's toxic in obvious ways when we enter war and people are harmed. But it's also toxic to us to know about it. So very often, and including in a conversation just before this presentation, talking with Ray about militarization in Central America, it's like, well, didn't it make you angry? Didn't it make you sad? When we experience these things, when we take in this knowledge, it can make us feel impotent or angry or depressed. And so what I feel in my own experience and what I want us to think about as you take in this information today, which is not only toxic for children, it's toxic for adults as well, is that we're handling toxic materials. So think about when you handle toxic materials, you have to be really careful. You have to educate yourself about them in order to handle them properly and not be harmed yourself, even if you're handling them in such a way that you are trying to transform them. The other thing I want to say before going into the subject matter is that my own sense, I think a lot of people believe that there is a certain progress to human history, and that progress means that we are going to definitively overcome certain human problems, whether that is war, or whether it's disease, or whether it's inequality, or any number of things that happen in human experience, and that we are working towards a time when all of these things will be overcome. And it might seem strange to hear from an activist, but I actually do not believe that. I think it's very possible that our species will become extinct within a countable number of generations. But I also strongly believe and feel in my own experience and see in other people's experience that we have agency, that it is not all black and white, that we play a role in human history, that we are not inert in human history. And therefore, whatever happens definitively in our species experience, that we have a role to play in making it better. And that's what motivates me and inspires me when I see what other people do. Now, a lot of people think, it's so big, it's too massive. Or the thing is so entrenched, there's no way we can really change this. So this particular pair of quotes is what a man named Bernard Lafayette found when he was working for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and went to Selma, Alabama in 1963. Now, how many of you have seen the film Selma? Any of you have seen the film Selma? Okay. So those events take place primarily in 1965. SNCC went to Selma in 1963. And when Bernard Lafayette went there to do voter registration, all the people in SNCC, all the activists said, you can't bring about any change there. You're just gonna lose. And so they didn't even have it on their organizing list of places to go for that particular year. So what Bernard Lafayette did before he went to Selma is he went to this funny institution called the library. And before there was the internet, before you could Google everything and its brother, he went to find out something about Selma from the library, and he found out about its history and its social relationships and its people and its economy and its politics. And one of the things that he found out was that Selma had been the state capital, and the state capital had been moved out of Selma, and he theorized that the white people in Selma felt a resentment, and actually heard that white people in Selma felt a resentment about no longer having the state capital there. And that resentment was partly what was being acted out in the repression of black people within that town. So I tell this story because I think we often don't think that research can be useful to us, but here is a case where the civil rights movement just didn't come because Rosa Parks decided to not get out of her seat, or even because she had been trained in nonviolence before that and was an active member of the NAACP. But that research and understanding things can play a role. And that's, I think, Patrick alluded to this, is that I think that in order to transform militarism, you have to understand it. You have to study it. You have to see the way it works, what its dynamics are, who is active in it, who's leading it, where the money flows are, who's impacted by it, who might be ambivalent about it, and then design what it is we're going to do based on those things. And I like to do research, so that seemed like my contribution. One of the most toxic documents I ever read was this a few years ago. It was a white paper from the US Air Force called Global En route Strategy. And one of the reasons why it was so toxic is because it stated in very dry, kind of formless or bloodless terms the ways in which the US military it attempts to be and is globally present and interconnected, and makes no bones about that. So at that time, they were discussing what was called the 1-4-2-1 plus strategy. What was that strategy? That was that the force should be able to defend the homeland, operate in and from 4 forward regions in the world, swiftly defeat adversaries in 2 overlapping military campaigns, while preserving the option to win decisively one of those campaigns, and conduct humanitarian operations. So this was the strategy, and actually still is the strategy of the US military. Our nation state wants the capacity to do all of those things simultaneously. And so this document had these maps that showed how things have to get from one place to another. If you're going to do all those things, you have to be able to move things globally from one place to another along many different routes. And you have to think about access, and you have to think about conditions, and you have to think about the technology. You have to think about what's already in place versus what you're going to have to put in place. And so these maps were ways of illustrating that attempt at global control and access. And so in the case of the Latin American one on the right, the United States when this map was made in 2008, was already present in Colombia in a major way, and had been, I'll get back to this in a little bit. And what the map was showing was if we had C-17s based at Palenquero Air Base in Colombia, we would be able not only to operate in Colombia, but we would be able to operate in that radius, and if you had some refueling access along the way, you could get almost to the bottom of South America, to Tierra del Fuego. In other words, the ambitions of the US military were no longer limited to counter-drug and counter-terrorist operations in Colombia. They were also interested in projecting that force throughout the continent. Other nations in the continent had a response to this, which was, we don't like that. What are you doing? You don't even tell us you're doing this. What are your intentions? And the Union of South American Nations then had some meetings, and we got a copy of this document out, and it got to Hugo Chavez. He denounced this in the meeting, and most of the South American governments opposed it. And the agreement that would have placed US troops in Colombia and in a more institutionalized, consolidated manner was defeated in the Colombian courts. Anyway, that's just a little story. But reading the document, when I first read the document, it kind of made me sick, because I realized what the intentions were of the US government and the US military. Now, I want to give you a little framework about ways in which US militarism operates at the governmental level. Because a lot of times people think about militarism and you think about war, or people think about different forms. So I want to, I don't really know on PowerPoint how to do a Venn diagram, but I would have done one if I could. But anyway, these are interlocking. They overlap with each other. So you have, on the one hand, preparation for war. You're not going to go to war if you don't prepare for war. So there's all the things that are related to training and preparation. And some of this is for our own troops, and some of it is for other nations or allied nations' troops. And it takes a lot of space within the environment. So in order to do those things, whether you're working with equipment, whether you're working with aircraft, whether you're working with ships, whether you're working with weapons that go a short distance or a long distance, you're going to need airspace. You're going to need access to the sea. You're going to need land. And increasingly, with the greater capacity, military capacity, you need more. And so that has its own set of impacts. And so, for example, some people know about the School of the Americas, which has now been renamed the Western Hemisphere Institute for Security Cooperation. That's just one example of many training institutions, and it's located on a training base at Fort Benning, Georgia. Now, then there's operations, which is typically more what we might hear about, right? So that includes war, where you're not just preparing, but you're actually carrying it out, and you have the boots on the ground. But it also includes other kinds of things that are military or quasi-military. So all the things that are related to border control. Increasingly, law enforcement is using military methods, equipment, and doctrine. Prisons are also another way in which the force of the state is an operational matter. And in terms of, as a researcher, a lot of these things are reflected in contracts to purchase either equipment or services from the private sector, as well as people who are employed by the government to actually carry out these operations, who would be soldiers in uniform and so on, or civilians as well. Now, then there's assistance, right? Because increasingly, the United States does not want to put boots on the ground. It's unpopular. This is what we saw a year and a half ago when President Obama put out the question, should we go to war in Syria or not? And there was a very broad consensus No, we don't want to send thousands and thousands more troops abroad overseas. So what the United States does instead is work with allies, work with partners. And this is what is called building partner capacity. Now, there's also assistance within the United States. So the Pentagon, Department of Homeland Security give grants to local police departments and sheriffs, county sheriffs, often with military equipment. And this is another way in which that assistance works. Now, for foreign assistance, traditionally that has gone through the State Department. And so there is a process by which that occurs, but increasingly it's going directly through the Pentagon. And then there are military sales. So this is not where the United States is, the taxpayer is directly paying for weapon systems, but a foreign nation is purchasing those things. And increasingly the US economy depends on military sales. And this, it's kind of a toxic brew of militarism and capitalism. I'll talk a little bit more about that. But one of the implications of it is that because it is sales and it is not coming directly out of tax dollar budgets, the same human rights laws that would apply to assistance do not apply to foreign military sales. But in any case, it is a tool of foreign policy. Now, there are, of course, other forms of militarism, so that are commercial, that are not part of the state, that are very integrated into our culture. So, for example, in 2014, of the 11 top grossing films, 9 of them dealt with war, were about war in one way or another. So, everything from The Hobbit, right, and the five, what is it, the five armies, right, the Battle of the Five Armies, to this, that's what this image is from, to American Sniper, to Guardians of the Galaxy. So, and Selma was number 64 at the box office, to give some sense. And of course, it's also reflected in our language, in our fashion, the kind of clothes we wear, that militarism is very integrated culturally and economically. But today, I'm going to talk more about forms of militarism that are practiced or facilitated by the state, by public institutions and government institutions. And one of the reasons why, one of the things I've been very interested in lately is the definition of the state. So this is a broadly accepted definition from the sociologist Max Weber that the state is a human community that can claim a monopoly on the legitimate use of physical force or of violence within a territory, a physical territory. And I think this is worth reflecting on, this particular definition of a state, because I think that often we think of the state as benevolent, and you can have benevolence. But the reason why I think it's important is that if you have a monopoly, and if the legitimate use of force is not contested, then the state is basically able to keep control, right? You have state control, and therefore, you could have an illegitimate use, a monopoly on the illegitimate use of force. So if you live in a neighborhood where the mafia is in control, typically that neighborhood is very peaceful because the mafia controls everything. Now that is an example of illegitimate force. But within that community, it might appear legitimate because everything's cool, like there's no problem. They take care of it. If someone contests that, and they are then the subject of repression by an illegitimate force or by the state, then you begin to have a debate around the state's use of force. But that we define the state as something that exercises violence, I think it's just worth reflecting on. Now, okay, so let's just get a little sense of the dimensions of what we're talking about here. So the U.S. military, compared to the rest of the world, is much larger than approximately the next 8 largest military spenders combined, right? We have more than 40% of world military spending just on our own. And it should be noted that a number of these next largest spenders are allies of the United States. It's not like we have to be bigger than all of them because they're going to make war against us, because they actually would be deployed and are deployed in wars with the United States against other opponents. So that's one measure. Another measure is within our own national budget, and this is the discretionary spending budget. So this is what Congress is able to decide on each year. There's a certain amount of mandatory spending. So when we get a paycheck and the Social Security and the FICA is taken out, that is mandatory spending. So the federal government uses that, and there's other mandatory spending as well that are in federal title law that Congress can't decide every year. But every year Congress does decide on a certain amount of federal spending. And of that, approximately 54% is spent on the military. Now, this does not include a number of things that you might consider to be part of our military. It doesn't include Department of Homeland Security. Doesn't include Border Patrol. Doesn't include, in the Department of Energy, the spending that we have on nuclear weapons, which are not part of the Pentagon budget, but are part of the Department of Energy budget. So, and it certainly does not include some of the intelligence agencies whose budget is not disclosed. So this is just a little bit about the scale, right? What it is that we're in. So now is where I have a question for you. And this has to do with, okay, there's the military side of life, and there's the civilian side of life. So I want to ask you, what do you consider to be, what is a definition, or what do you think it means to be a civilian? Or that something, not necessarily a person, or a person is civilian. What does that mean to you? Anyone?
Not being involved in the military.
Not being involved in the military, like not being a member of the military?
Well, except that I'm still supporting it through my tax dollars, right?
Okay. So if you support it through your tax dollars, does that make you not a civilian?
Good question.
You're not sure. Anyone else?
I would say not having any decision-making ability. I feel increasingly that being a civilian means that you have no voice because corporations have a voice and the government responds to the corporation.
Uh-huh. So the people who are running the corporations, they're not civilians.
Well, I hadn't thought of it that way, of course.
You know, like, so when the 911 people, when they went after the World Trade Center, which is the center of American capitalism, they were going after people who were not civilians.
Well, I don't know that that follows. I mean, a corporation is supposed to be this sort of personless entity which has taken on all kinds of power.
Uh-huh.
It's given all kinds of rights that many of us think only belong to citizens. So I guess what maybe I'm defining more what I am increasingly feeling as a citizen rather than a civilian. I'm not sure if there's a technical difference there, but as a citizen, I guess I'd consider that I'm feeling really powerless. I've been to a couple of state commissions recently where I've just been shunted aside and said, well, we have to follow the agenda and we can't deal with that.
Although I think you might also find that people who sign up for the military and become soldiers, they get into ROTC or they sign up, they also might feel pretty powerless, right? So that doesn't make them a civilian because they're in uniform, they're perhaps even in combat. But they might feel like there are powers above them that are making decisions for them. Anyone else? Yeah.
And online contributors suggest that we're all civilians, probably under that context.
Okay, interesting. So I'm going to give you some more specific questions. So do you think that these people are civilians? Anyone not think that either of these people is a civilian, per se? These are drug users, if you hadn't kind of captured that. Bob Marley, one of the most famous smokers of marijuana, and here's someone shooting up. Okay, so I don't hear any dispute yet. Are these folks civilians? They're growing coca leaf. And this is Evo Morales, who is one of the most famous growers of coca leaf in the world. He's not growing it anymore, but he's certainly chewing it. Are they civilians? Yes? No? Maybe? Think so? Okay. So here are people who are on the train coming from Central America through Mexico to the United States. Are they civilian? So far I hear yes. Okay. Here are some children. One of whom is making a gang sign, and the other of whom is clearly armed. And they have been recruited into gangs in Central America. Are they civilians? They're civilians. You're not sure?
Yeah, I'm starting to move over.
What's going on in your mind?
Because the being armed and being part of an organized cartel, even though they are recruited and are somewhat powerless in how they got there, they are now part of an organized armed effort.
All right. So being part of an organized armed effort moves someone out of the civilian category. Perhaps. So, well, here's the definition in international law, which is that civilians are persons who are not members of the armed forces, which is sort of where I think you were coming from in the beginning. And so both civilians and combatants have very specific rights in an armed conflict, but they're not the same ones. So civilians have the right not to be attacked in an armed conflict. There are a number of rules in international law about the use of military force in ways that are supposed to protect civilians in terms of discriminate use and proportionate use of force that are supposed to protect civilians. Yes?
An online user asks, are you associating moral judgments to terms civilians? They're interested in seeing how this relates to militarism.
Okay, good question. So I have judgments, certainly, but first I want to understand what it is we're talking about. Because often you will have a discussion about whether someone is civilian, and the implicit assumption is that if they are not, that they could be attacked, right? If they are, then the attack is illegal or wrong. And so in that sense, I think it's important for us to understand who is being impacted and who is permitted to be impacted by armed conflict. And increasingly, the examples I gave you, you may have noticed, are associated with the drug war. So in the drug war, we often think of that as metaphoric. That it's like the war on poverty. It's not really a war. It's not like the war in Iraq or Afghanistan. It's a metaphor. And in fact, increasingly, the language, the rules of engagement, the equipment, the missions that are associated with the drug war, particularly in Latin America, but increasingly within the United States, are like those of real war. And part of that has to do with how we define who is the enemy, who is our opponent in this war. If it is a war on drugs, are we really fighting a war against a substance? And is this substance fighting back? Like what is this war for which we are deploying all this military force? That's what I'm trying to understand in order to address what are injustices that occur within that. So in that context, I've asked myself recently, what is the difference between war and law enforcement? Because typically, in fighting drugs or drug offenses or crimes that are associated with illicit substances, we think of that as a law enforcement task. And in fact, the Pentagon and most militaries in Latin America never wanted to get involved in the drug war. They did not see that either as a winning fight or as something to which they were trained or that their mission really was appropriate for them. But over time, especially as when the Soviet Union collapsed, the US military saw an opportunity for a new mission in Latin America. In any case, we think of these things as different, and they are different in many respects. Law enforcement involves police rather than military forces. It should respond to civilian laws rather than laws of war. Law enforcement is an ongoing function. Like we think of the military or war as something that has a beginning and an end. We don't think of law enforcement as having a beginning and an end in time. But it is something that we will always need. This is the way we think of it. And that law enforcement typically is local or within a nation, whereas war could be within a nation or it could be international. Now, I've posed this list of things, but of course there is the ideal, and then there is what is happening in practice. And I think it's important to distinguish between those as well, because a lot of times when I've asked this question, if you ask someone, for example, who is in a community that is heavily impacted by militarized racist law enforcement, then they'll be like, what do you mean they're bringing people to criminal justice? Or what do you mean they're working with civilian laws? That's not the way they operate in my community. So it's important. I think some of the ideal part of this is aspirational. We want law enforcement to be obeying civilian laws and not to be obeying the laws of war.
Well, by the same token, couldn't you say that it's aspirational to say that war is temporary?
Absolutely.
Or that the laws of war are followed in war?
Absolutely. The very same thing applies in terms of what we hope or want for what will occur in war, or that wars will not occur.
Rather than war, would we not be better to think of it in terms of world enforcement?
Enforcement of what?
Well, enforcement of the powers that shouldn't be. Enforcement of the way, in this case, the U.S. wants things to be.
Uh-huh.
We are the law enforcement of the world. And we don't have to follow laws of war, we follow the laws that we decide.
Laws of human rights.
In the real situation, that is the way it's working. And I think, Patrick talked about other tools that are available to us to address those conflicts where we don't have to resort to war. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about the costs of war. And in the way that you have framed this, you might be thinking that the United States uses its own rules because it benefits, right? Okay, if we don't have to obey all the laws that other people obey, we benefit. And there are certain ways in which the United States gets advantage by being the militarily most powerful. But my argument would be that in the long run, we lose. And often in the short run. And so I'll be talking a little bit more about the costs of that strategy as well. So, yes?
Yes, online user asks, what form and level of military capability is acceptable, both for the United States and for other powers in the world?
That is a question, I believe, for a democratic process. I don't think I can say what is acceptable. We need mechanisms by which we can jointly decide what is acceptable, including and especially those people who are impacted by militarism. So I think I'll deflect on that one just for the moment, and we might be able to come back to it. But I want to talk a little bit more about some of these categories or functional forms of militarism. So training, as I noted at the beginning, is part of the preparation for war. One of the interesting things about training is that the arguments that are often made are fiscal, right? And I showed you how much things cost in dollars. Training by itself doesn't really cost a lot of money. Compared to the other things, like the F-35 or these huge weapon systems that over the course of their lifetime, the F-35 is going to cost over $1 trillion over the course of its lifetime. Training is relatively inexpensive. So often the argument around it is not really about fiscal dollars because it's really more about preparing. And it is both for US and allied forces, as I said at the beginning. Now, to give one example, the Gulf of Alaska is the source for most of the salmon that is shipped out, or a very large part of the salmon that is consumed by the rest of the nation and exported as well. Now, a few years ago, the Navy said, we want to use a large portion of the Gulf of Alaska for live fire training. And they got a 5-year permit to do so. It is far enough offshore that the people in the nearest town of Cordova can't hear it or see it. But it is in this area where there's not only a very important economic element of fishing, but also marine mammals that are going to be affected. So now the Navy has a plan to start this bombing. They've done a little bit, but now they're going to accelerate it. A lot of this is as a political signal, because as global warming accelerates and the Arctic melts, there is a fight for the control of the Arctic. So the Navy wants to send a signal to Russia and to other northern nations that we're here and we're ready to act. And so that's the motive, even stated motive, behind these exercises. But it's going to use lots of live munitions, and the Navy's own environmental impact statement acknowledges that it could have a very significant impact on both farm fishing and marine mammals. And I will come back to that in just a moment. So one of the things I do in trying to understand militarism is looking at contracts. It's very concrete. It makes it much more concrete. And there's this database online called usaspending.gov that posts all federal contracts. I can't remember what the minimum is. It's like $10,000 or $20,000. And they're whether of any federal agency, and you can find out where it's going to be performed, what entity signed it, when it was signed, how much it's for, what the federal agency was that was contracting it, a little bit, very little bit about what it's for. And then a lot of other data about each of those contracts. And there's hundreds of thousands of them that are posted for the Pentagon. The federal government, in its wisdom, just redesigned the website, and it's now much harder to use. But so I wanted to say, okay, well, what are some of the Pentagon contracts in Oregon? I'm going to be in Oregon. What are some of the Pentagon contracts that are here? And one of the things I learned is that one of the biggest Pentagon contract here in Portland in the last year was to Vigor Marine or Vigor Industrial. And this was to retrofit a naval vessel, the USS Emory S. Land, for just under $17 million. It was signed last July, and it was supposed to be completed 2 months ago. And the mission of this particular ship is to repair naval submarines. There is also a contract for to add to the USNS John Glenn, which is part of the Navy's prepositioning force for large-scale logistics movements, such as the transfer of vehicles and equipment from sea to shore. And it will significantly reduce dependency on foreign ports. Now, if you think about that, why would you want to reduce dependency on foreign ports? If you are doing a naval ship operation of some kind, why would you want to reduce that dependency? Presumably, it's because you're in a port that is not of a cooperating ally. So it might be that you're working with an ally who doesn't support your mission, or it might be that you're near or in the port of an adversary. And you want to be able to resupply in that environment. Again, this is a way in which it's the innocuous, seemingly innocuous nature of our industry is also part of the ways in which we position ourselves to impose our will in the rest of the world. Now, Patrick and I went by Vigor Marine, by the shipyard yesterday, just to kind of poke around. We didn't really find out very much. We came unannounced, and we didn't have an appointment. But the other thing that I had learned from going online was that Vigor is not just doing military contracts. So they're looking for whatever is going to employ people, really. I mean, they're a shipbuilder and they're a ship maintenance outfit. So one of their recent jobs was actually for Trident Seafoods. So Trident Seafoods is the principal exporter of salmon from Alaska. So the same naval operations that in the Gulf of Alaska could very well impact the salmon on which Trident Seafoods depends is also connected to an operation. This particular shipyard is also doing naval operations that could affect their civilian business. So it becomes this circle, reinforcing circle, by which militarism closes the space within our civilian economy for more civilian work, if in fact the salmon are affected. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the environmental costs of militarism. And again, there's some that are kind of obvious. So you have, both in training and in operations, you have all kinds of contamination and pollution. There is also things that are less visible. So at sea, you have sonar that affect marine mammals very deeply. And then when war occurs, you have the debris that is left over. Or when training occurs, you have debris that are left over. And in international law, it's very undeveloped, the holding of responsibility for those who contaminate territory, whether it's their own territory or other people's territory. Within the United States, there is Superfund law, there's the EPA, and so on, which has been very difficult to hold the military accountable for contamination. But there's some stuff in place. There's a funding flow. But overseas, whether it's for training or whether it's in military operations, there's very little that will hold the polluter accountable. Now, there's also opportunity costs. So back to how our tax dollar is spent, and you'll notice this energy and environment over on the right-hand side has 1.6 cents out of your tax dollar. So if we actually were to invest in the sustainability of a non-fossil fuel economy, it would require public investment. There's an interesting writer named George Monbiot who did an experiment for the UK. And he wanted to see, okay, so the scientists say that in order to avoid the tipping point in our climate, we need to reduce our dependency on fossil fuels by 90% by the year 2030. Sounds totally impossible. So he did an experiment and wrote a book about it called Burn, in which he looked at all the different sectors that use fossil fuels and what would be required, even maintaining the standard of living, and he looked at the UK, in order to convert and reduce by 90% the use of fossil fuels. And he was able to crack it. This is, of course, assuming the political will. Big question. He was able to crack it for every single sector except for air travel. So Germany is actually undertaking this, is reducing its dependency on fossil fuel. But Germany only spends, and it's one of the top spenders in the world on the military, but it only spends 1.4% of its GDP on the military, whereas the United States spends 3.9% of its GDP. If we were to reorient that towards an investment in renewable fuels, we might have a different chance. So the one other thing I want to mention about environmental costs is the fossil fuel use itself by the military. And again, I was in researching Pentagon contracts, I would come upon, and I was looking at where they're performed, particularly in Latin America. And the thing that always skewed it, that couldn't really, I couldn't really tell, well, are they doing military operations in this country, was fuel. Because naval ships or other kinds of equipment within the US military would want to refuel in a place. They weren't doing operations there, but it was like in the late 19th century and early 20th century, the way the US used coal ports in order to refuel their ships and expand the American empire. So that fueling is another way in which there's an environmental cost, because the US military is the largest single user of fossil fuels in the world. Okay, now turning to assistance. A lot of if you look in the Pentagon literature and the RAND Corporation reports, what this is called is building partner capacity, BPC. Everything has an acronym. So if you think about those three words, they all sound really good. Building, partner, capacity. I mean, I like all those things. But then you ask yourself, okay, capacity for what? And that's where you get into kind of the shadowy side. One of the important things that I think is often not considered in this is that this is a tool for foreign policy. So it should be part of the construction of our foreign policy. And as assistance to other nations increasingly is a Pentagon function, it is not as much a part of the foreign policy making. So essentially, the military makes more of the foreign policy through action. You know, military people are very oriented towards action. What are you going to do? Which is an important question. What are you going to do? But there is a whole policy formation process that the State Department, or in any nation, the Foreign Relations Ministry undertakes to think through what should be our relationship with each of these nations. With whom do we want to ally ourselves? Who are good, quote, partners? And within our nation, the idea of American exceptionalism is that our assistance is always good, right? We are the good guys, and so we're teaching human rights. We uphold human rights. We are a democratic nation, and we are then going to support those things that are good. Now, this also depends on the idea that you can always tell the good guys from the bad guys, and that people don't change, and also that your equipment or your capacity that you are building will not migrate from one actor to another, will not be used by one actor for purposes different than you imagined. And this is where blowback comes from. Sometimes I think the policymakers are sincere. This is the objective that we have with this particular assistance package. But once you give that assistance, you're handing it over to another nation. You might have lots of influence and control in some respects and leverage. The United States often doesn't use that leverage because another problem comes up, right? And therefore, the elimination of something becomes the elimination of an evil, of a bad thing, of a bad guy, of a bad guy's capacity, becomes much more important than the behavior of those whom we're assisting. Now, the other thing is a self-interest issue, and that is the way in which assistance often leads to more sales. So like if I'm a salesman and I decide, okay, I'm gonna give you something, I'm gonna give you a sample. And I have this LCD projector here, I'll give you one. And then when it breaks, you're gonna buy one from me. And that's exactly the way the US military is increasingly working. So here is just in the example of Colombia, which was the subject of a very important set of a military package and set of assistance, particularly in the early to mid 2000s. So this particular graph breaks down things. The purple are the arms sales. And you can see that and this is from 2000 to 2010, you can see there's always been arms sales. But in the first half of the decade, there weren't that many compared to the blue, which was the State Department channeled foreign assistance, and the red, which was the Pentagon associated assistance. So the vast majority of stuff in the first half of the decade was assistance. As that assistance was reduced, the amount of sales was increased, particularly in the purchase of Black Hawk helicopters. To get a sense of the scale of foreign assistance, this is from 2004 through the proposed package for the coming fiscal year. And it's run typically between $10 and $20 billion per year in foreign military and police assistance. In the early part of the 2000s, in George W. Bush's first term, for example, it was much less than that. But now it's become a much bigger part of the US, quote, toolbox. Now, there are assumptions about military aid that are made on all sides. I am a pacifist. I am part of a community of people, a network of people who do not believe in war. I suspect most people in this room are against war. And most of the people in my community believe intuitively that if you give military aid, it will make things worse. People in the policymaking community are working with different set of assumptions. And often these assumptions are not interrogated with evidence. So they're working with that same Weberian concept of if we can get control, often called security, almost always called security, then we will be able to have peace, and then we can have development, and we can have democratic exercise of rights, and human rights will be respected, and so on. How will we know? How will we know which of these perspectives about the impact of military assistance is right, and in which circumstances, and how would we measure that? So we went and took a look at Colombia. And Colombia, because it is an example of a U.S. investment in military assistance where the U.S. is claiming success. And it was a heavy investment. So even when the war in Iraq was at its height, the largest number of people, police and military in the world trained during those years between 2002 and 2008 were from Colombia, more than Iraq, Afghanistan, Philippines, Pakistan, etc. These days, that is being claimed as a model for other nations as a success.
Was this because of the drug war?
It was initially because of the drug war. So in Clinton's second term, in his post-Monica phase, he was looking politically weak, and he decided to introduce something that would support the drug war. And it was at the same time as the civil war in Colombia was escalating. And the policymakers were afraid they were going to lose Colombia. So this was the investment of money in what was called Plan Colombia, which initially it was $1.5 billion in 2000 and 2001. It was just for the drug war. Now, after September 11th, you may recall that anything that was called terrorism, the money was thrown at it. So the mandate for U.S. policy, U.S. assistance in Colombia was expanded after September 11th in 2002 to include a directly counterinsurgent mission. So for the rest of the decade and to this day, it is both counter-drug and, quote, counter-terrorist. The president of Colombia, Álvaro Uribe, and President George Bush were tight friends. I mean, there were a lot of things that contributed to this particular alliance. And the Colombian military pushed back the guerrillas, this is a 50-year-old insurgency, strategically, out of the cities and out of the roads. But there was a very high cost. And one of the main costs, there are many, but one of them was something known as false positives. So what happened? The president, Uribe, was pressuring for operational successes. And those operational successes were measured in the number of kills, enemy kills. So we had the body count syndrome, same thing as in Vietnam. So as the guerrillas receded and were harder to engage, the army, in order to respond to the demands from higher up for operational successes, began to produce positives that were not really enemy guerrillas. They were civilians, often people who were homeless, who had some kind of criminal background, maybe were developmentally disabled, people who the army thought no one would miss, poor typically. So someone would recruit them, tell them there was work in another part of the country, bring them somewhere else, the army would execute them and count them as guerrillas killed in combat. And there are thousands of these cases, thousands. We documented between 2000 and 2010, 5,763 extrajudicial killings, reported extrajudicial killings by the armed forces of civilians. And so we wanted to understand what was the relationship of this terrible phenomenon with this U.S. assistance. And you can track the assistance, and in this case, it's tracking of civilian killings, that's in the red, and the number of Colombian soldiers trained by the United States in the previous 2 years, believing that there is some lag impact to training on behavior. Now, you'll see that this red, the civilian killings went down in late 2008. And the reason why was it became a scandal. And this is part of the success, our success side, is that the human rights community mobilized, the families, the army did not count on this, began to denounce that their loved ones were being taken and killed and counted as guerrillas. And part of what they couldn't stand was that it was a lie. It's one thing if you kill my husband or my father, but then if you say he was killed because he was a guerrilla when he was a farmer, or he was a shopkeeper, or he was in school, that somehow, a lot of the families, they just could not take. So people mobilized around that. The press took it up. The international human rights organizations, like the people that I've worked with, took it up. The UN Human Rights High Commissioner for Human Rights, which has an office in Colombia, also took it up. And it became a scandal, and at some point, the military had to stop the operations, so this is another way in which the international community has an impact, right? We're looking at the impact of military assistance, but we also saw that because the civilian killings dropped, partly as a result of the impact, the influence of the international community. Now, we looked at units within the Colombian military that got U.S. assistance, that were approved for assistance under a human rights law called the Leahy Law. But we also looked at individuals, because a lot of what foreign assistance and training does is it invests in leaders, and those leaders are commanders. So that can be at the base level. You're going to train a whole bunch of the cadets, just into or out of officer school, or it could be later on in their career. And we found that there are some who turn out really badly. So this guy was Colonel Mejia, Hernan Mejia was a total protege of the United States. He had spent time at the Inter-American College. He had done 2 stints at Fort Bragg in psychological operations. He had been in the Haiti multinational operation, and it turned out that he allied himself with paramilitary mafia and was then convicted and sentenced to 19 years in prison. Now, here's this other guy who was also a protege. He had been a teacher at the School of the Americas. He'd gone to the U.S. Army the command course at Fort Leavenworth, and he turned out to be a whistleblower on the Colombian military's collaboration with paramilitary death squads. So we wanted to know why there were different results. I can't say that we totally answered that, but we looked at the School of the Americas, which is a very highly contested U.S. military training program for Latin American soldiers. Contested in part because in its history, there have been abusers who have committed atrocities who were graduates from there or who carried out coups. And then we heard the people at the school who said, you shouldn't count everybody as a graduate, because some of them, they just go there for 2 weeks when they're 22 years old, and then they do something 20 years later. So we said, okay, all right, we're going to look at the people that we've been able to identify who spent 6 months or longer at the school, and then what happened when they went back. And so we were able to identify 29 Colombian officers who spent 6 months or longer there, either as instructors or taking courses. This is after the school was reformed and supposedly is cleaned up its act in 2000. And we looked at how many of the subsequently were accused of commanding a unit that committed extrajudicial killings or themselves were accused of a serious crime, compared to a random sample of other Colombian soldiers or officers. Same rank, same branches, and so on. And we found that there was a much higher number of those who had gone to WINSEC who ended up commanding units that committed extrajudicial killings or were themselves accused than those who were chosen randomly. Now, we put all this in a report, and this report we presented last June in Colombia, in Bogota, and we talked about the role of commanders, because we found that a lot of the commanders who had units where there were a lot of civilian killings, they rose in rank. So some of the commanders who had the largest numbers of extrajudicial killings in their units became commanders of the army, which is not a good sign. And as it turned out, the active duty officer who had the largest number of extrajudicial killings under his command was this man named Jaime Lasprilla Villamizar. He had 75 killings under his command during a 16-month period in 2007, 6 and 7. And so when we released this report in Bogota, I talked about that. It's like, well, the U.S. should look at its assistance, because he was a U.S. protege as well. He had taught at the School of the Americas. He had gone to the National Defense University for a year just before being deployed to this unit that committed killings. And that the Colombians should also look at his role as commander. So I was interviewed in a TV program, and I showed this this particular thing that with our graph of those particular killings. And then the TV news program that interviewed me went and interviewed him. And he said they were all clean kills. There were no civilian killings on my watch in this particular brigade. So he basically denied all of them. He didn't say there was any particular problem at all. He just said no, nothing, none. So then a few weeks later, I got back to the United States and I got a call or an email from another officer who I'd interviewed. And he said, General Esprilla would like to meet with you. And he invites you to come to Bogota and so he can explain his operations to you. And he'll pay your way. And I said, wow, that's pretty interesting.
One way?
I said, well, you're not going to pay my way because I want independence. And he said, okay, well, and we had a 4-hour meeting. He was really mad, really, really mad. And during the meeting, the co-author of this report, a Colombian man named Alberto Yepes, this man, he was not in the meeting. So the meeting is from 5 p.m. to 9 p.m. And at 6:30, he was assaulted by 2 armed men who robbed him of his laptop and of his cell phones, and not his wallet. Very super clear message. And so, here's one thing where you don't think that research is going to have that kind of real world impact. But one big reason why they're worried is because there's a peace process in Colombia. And there is likely to be some kind of transitional justice process. And in that process, there is discussion about holding army officers accountable for some of these killings. So he had his lawyer in the room during our meeting. And they're worried about prosecutions. So I'm going to skip forward to a couple things, but I just want to make one point is that for, knowledge, we can come up with knowledge and do research, but I never want it just to be for knowledge's sake. So we're in an academic institution here, and an academic scholarly knowledge and findings are super important, partly because the methodologies and because the legitimacy that they lend sometimes because of those methodologies. But if it's not used for something, then I'm not really sure what its value is by itself. Journalists often are in a similar boat. Like a lot of times they want to find out things, and so they get on this quest for information, and that can become its own thing. So for me, I want information not only to change things, but I want to be accountable to the people who are impacted by militarism. And so I'm going to jump ahead here, but I leave you with this question of how can we be accountable to people who are impacted directly by militarism? And there's, I think, some questions that we can ask around that. So I'm going to go ahead here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the drug war in Mexico. And so in many respects, the drug war in Colombia was successful because it moved the drug trafficking out of Colombia and into Central America and Mexico. That's the way the drug war often works. It's a water balloon because you don't deal with demand, you deal with supply. If you squeeze in one part of the water balloon, the water goes into another part. So the trafficking and the production, when anti-drug operations are successful, moves out of that geographic area and into another area because it's very profitable. And so that's what we found in Mexico is that in the mid-2000s, the drug cartels were becoming more powerful. So when Felipe Calderón came into office in 2006, he declared war on the drug cartels and deployed the military to Mexican cities. And a recent study came out that of 18 cities where they were deployed, either homicides did not go down or they went up. Now, At the same time, the U.S. is exporting firearms to Mexico. The U.S. was supporting this drug war in many different respects. And one of the significant things about this is that, okay, you think here are firearms, guns, whatever, you know, people can have guns. In Mexico, the personal possession of firearms is prohibited. So the availability of guns in the United States becomes very important to the cartels that want to fight for territory. They want to control territory. In order to do that, they use military means. And that's the way in which the United States is helping to arm the cartels, through the sale of weapons commercially in federally in gun sellers near our border. The impact has been that in Mexico there have been approximately 100,000 homicides. It's very difficult to measure how many of them were related to the drug war. And one of the most prominent ones occurred last September in Ayotzinapa and Guerrero, when there were 43 students who were in town in Aguala, and they were taken by police. And the police handed them over to a mafia group, a drug trafficking group, who disappeared them. And so the family members, this is on top of all these different homicides in which the police are often involved. Either they're handing people over, or they're working with one of the cartels in opposition to another cartel to control territory. And this has become a major issue in Mexico. At the same time, the United States is increasingly selling weapons to Mexico. So this is a piece that I wrote that was just based on official information from U.S. sources, U.S. government sources, some military press sources, and that over the last year, the U.S. has officially sold more than $1 billion worth of weapons to Mexico. Now, there is an idea that the paradigm is shifting in U.S. policy, and that we're no longer relying so much on the military in order to, that we're going to have social programs, that it's not going to be like Plan Colombia. But in fact, the military sales is one of the things that shows that it is, that the United States participation in this is very military. And those changes in opinion were reflected in the fact that a few days after this came out, the Mexican equivalent of Newsweek put on its cover this story using the same information about the United States selling more than $1 billion of weapons to Mexico in the course of a year. And then yesterday, I just found out about this yesterday, and there's a friend of mine, a journalist in Mexico, who said, it seems like we're close to a breakthrough because in people's understanding of what this is for. So one of the things that we did a couple years ago, we run a caravan of Mexican victims of violence, whether that was by drug cartels or whether that was by state forces. And we're crossing the United States in order to talk about the U.S.'s role in this particular war. And we decided that we would take a real assault weapon and destroy it in public. And we had to deal with all kinds of things like, well, is it legal? Is it going to go off? I mean, all kinds of things. How do you actually cut through the metal? How do you do this? And we worked with the victims, and they each told briefly some of their story about how guns were used in the crimes against them. And then we sawed the weapon in half, and we displayed it publicly. Now, here's the thing about guns. Just about everyone recognizes that there should be a line where that some kinds of weapons should not be allowed or legal for personal possession. Even people who are quote pro-gun, the vast majority would agree that personal possession of a howitzer or a tank should not be legal. So the debate is around where the line is. And what I would suggest is that if we were socialized to make it normal to have a howitzer at home. And people used it in practice and in their family, and there was a sport around it, and then you would hear voices for people saying, well, this should continue to be legal. Because on the one hand, it would demonstrate that there are people who can possess these things and not harm other people. It would also demonstrate the ways in which we have been desensitized to owning these weapons of destruction. And I would suggest, the Second Amendment and everything else, all those things would be tried out around the things of a howitzer. So this is the debate that we need to have: is what should that line be? It's not just about whether something is harmful or not. So I'm going to end with just one thought, which is that we're in Oregon, and in 1971, actually it wasn't 72, Oregon passed a bottle law, right, which required all bottles to be returnable. And at the time, I was 11 years old, and I was in the 5th grade, and we got these magazines in 5th grade called Junior Scholastic. And there was a little note about that. And I was like, wow, that's really neat. I live in New Jersey, which some people called the armpit of the nation. And so I decided I'm going to start a petition. So I got some friends, and we went house to house, and I got 162 signatures to ban non-returnable bottles in my town. And then we started a paper drive, and we got like tons and tons of newspaper that we recycled. And my town did not ban non-returnable bottles. But the example of Oregon was transmitted to New Jersey and set me on a path, at least, of activism and learning how to do activism and getting engaged. That's the power of example. We might think, okay, I'm only working in this limited area. And so if I can't affect the whole system, then what good is it to affect this little area? And that's where the power of example is really important. Because if we communicate that example to other people, including young people especially, then we can create and support other kinds of activism that will work on the whole system and that will work as part of a much larger fabric. So I think I'd like to open it up from there to conversation and questions, and want to thank everybody for your listening.
So we are going to have a little Q&A session here with our audience in the room, and then also our online viewers who can post the questions in the chat box. And I will take my privilege as moderator to ask the first question. Mm-hmm. You outlined something highly informative and very educational and informational. And I know it's the topic of a whole new workshop, but can you just briefly outline in general terms some of the tools available to transform those systems of militarism?
Well, there are so many tools. I think one of the things that's really important for us is to think about what we're good at and what we like to do. And think about how to use that in order to contribute to a larger process of change. And that can be related to our profession. It could be related to our community. It could be related to our identity. It could be related to specific skills that we have. It could be related to resources that we have that are not just financial, but other kinds of resources that we have. I think for me, that's a really important starting point. So I like to do research. I like to get down into the details. I like to find out things and then bring it out and try and put it together in some coherent manner. There are organizations that are at work here locally, nationally, internationally, I think one of the things that I think it's also good to ask ourselves is it meaningful for me to take a risk? So no one wants to be harmed, no one wants to waste their time. But for me, it becomes meaningful when we get together and do things together in a way that is building something. And I don't know, this is a very general answer because it's kind of a general question, I suppose. There's lots of resources out there in terms of, and I have a handout there about researching militarism, which also includes some activist and strategy resources that are online. And I just would point people to those as well.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions that I think I'll be very brief on, and I think you can answer several of them, or a couple of them really briefly. First of all, is the global route strategy document that you referred to at the beginning of your preparation, is that available online? Or do you know where we could get a copy of it?
I can send you a copy. It's interesting because it was online. It was at an Air Force, Maxwell Air Force Base conference proceedings that I just happened to find online. And I was doing a Google search for the name of the Air Force Base in Colombia that was rumored to be the spot where U.S. forces were going to stay. That's how I found it.
Okay.
Because palanquero is an unusual word. So I can forward you a copy. I think they may have taken it off after it became controversial.
Okay, well, the next thing I wanted to ask about what I thought seemed to be kind of a discrepancy in the spending. There was like a 50% spending on military that we saw in some graphs, but then when we talked about taxes, it was 27% military.
Right.
And
So it's
sure
the difference
there's a simple answer
between
to that, but
it's the difference between all spending that includes both discretionary and mandatory, and just discretionary. So the first graph, the pie chart that we saw, was just discretionary spending. That's what Congress decides on. But then the second one that was of the dollar bill divided up included mandatory spending, which includes Social Security and other kinds of things that Congress does not decide on. And most of the mandatory spending is not military.
I see. All right, thank you. Well, then I guess my main question is, we looked at the records about the Colombian military leaders, and don't those records kind of prove what the real military strategy is? Just like, what's happened in Ferguson and, is it South Carolina that it just happened in recently? Mm-hmm. Where the killings of black and brown people kind of shows what law enforcement is really about in this country. And I guess the basic question that I want to ask is, there weren't any hints in your talk about the deep state, and I wondered if you just think that that's kind of a conspiracy theory, or what might be behind a lot of this stuff that's militarism and law enforcement and spying on citizens and those kinds of things.
I don't discount that there are people in the state and intelligence agencies and so on who have a design, and the design doesn't look good. But I also think that there is the bigger problem for us is indifference. That's the bigger problem. There's a reason why people who have responded to Ferguson and the other killings of black people, that the principal slogan or words is Black Lives Matter. Because the way often law enforcement or the military act is that they do not matter. They are means to an end. So that end is often not necessarily about destroying those lives, per se. That end is, in the case of the Colombians, my commander is calling on me to produce kills. And it's kind of risky to go out and fight the guerrillas. So I'm going to do something that's a lot easier. And they don't count. The ways in which we act as if other lives do not count is not just reflected in the use of military and police force. It's also reflected in attitudes and the way people vote and the way people look at the world and talk about the world. As if, well, you know, you kind of expect Mexicans to be dying in large numbers. Isn't that kind of normal? People, I would suspect that there's many people that we know that think that. And so for me, that is the more important challenge. Partly because those are the people who I know better. Those are the people whom I can influence. I personally don't know anyone who in the CIA, at least who I know is in the CIA. So I want to impact the people who, where there's an issue that I'm connected to. And so that motivates me to focus especially on that.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to ask something about the academic angle and just kind of what you're speaking about with knowledge and responsibility and accountability. You know, I'm sure a lot of people here are familiar with just how much academia and the government in terms of foreign policy strategies historically has been involved. And just kind of a recent example of that, where I was doing my master's in Latin American studies, people in my program and people in the history department were approached by, you know, different representatives of branches of the government. So one woman who was an expert in Peru was approached by the CIA to work for them, and that was all through the academic institution.
And what did the CIA want her to do?
They were interested in hiring her and recruiting her for her expertise on, you know, particular areas in terms of the work that she had been doing. And I don't want to reveal her,
Right, yeah.
you know.
No,
like,
but yeah, okay.
But just, you know, just the awareness that I developed after being there in that environment that, you know, even our institute was required if a senior official or a retired ambassador or somebody who was a current ambassador, you know, if these people were interested in coming and speaking, we had to, or our program had to say yes because of the money that we received.
Well, I think there's a seduction, certainly. And I think often the way that seduction works is I have a body of knowledge. I know about a community, I'm an anthropologist, I'm an historian or whatever, and I want the policy and those who are in government to be acting in an informed way. I don't want them to be ignorant, because ignorance can lead to lots of problems as well. And so that becomes the seduction, like, well, maybe I can help them act better through good knowledge. And I think the issue there is that you're not, the aims of how that knowledge is going to be used often are not disclosed to you, or they happen later, and you don't have control over them. And sometimes it makes those forces more powerful to do things that we wouldn't want them to do. So I think it's good to raise issues around classification, that knowledge should be available to all. And you know, that it depends a little bit. Sometimes academics are drawn in not to do original research. They're drawn in to advise. And that when they're advising, then the classification issue is not about the knowledge they're creating, it's more about the advice they're giving or the policy that is being created out of that. You know, I think if we're going to have a conversation about policy, it should be open. It should be out on the table. That's the only way we can have a democratic process around these things, is to say, well, okay, well, this is what we know about it. How should we respond as a society? And that's where, in terms of any kind of intelligence agencies, I mean, there's also unclassified stuff that happens too. But I would raise some of the same questions.
Yes, we have a lot of questions from a pretty large online crowd. We have currently 29. And I guess the first, we'll dive back into what we touched on earlier. Someone
do you want to
mentioned
stack them?
What's that?
Do you want to stack them?
Sure, yeah. So someone mentioned that the what form and level of military capability is acceptable, and you mentioned that the democratic process weighs into that heavily. And so, considering the democratic process in America, users suggest that most Americans support the current level of military spending, and as well as a significant number of politicians want even more. So how would that play in, would be the first question. The second one, this was related to the U.S. military training in foreign countries. User asks, for there to be sellers, there must be buyers as well. So it appears that countries do feel the need to have some level of military capabilities. And a follow-up for that would be, should the U.S. be involved in a country's civil war? And if yes, under what criteria? You want to start with those?
Sure. So in terms of acceptable military capacity, I'd say two things. One is that, in fact, when you ask people where they would like their tax dollars to be spent in public polling, most people want much less spent on the military than we currently spend. They want more on education, more on health, more on housing, more on other infrastructure. So I would suggest that if that were the criterion, then it would be quite different. Second is that when you have dependency on an economic activity, it's very difficult to get off of it. So both in terms of U.S. domestic support for it, as well as the foreign buyers, there's an economic as well as a political dependency on those military means, as well as the options that are put out for how to deal with a particular problem. And that's, I think, also reflected. If we put out different kinds of options and say, this is another way of dealing with this problem, and the resources that we have, and you pose it that way, rather than should we just sell military or spend on military or not, it becomes a different outcome. And then in terms of U.S. involvement in another country's civil war, generally I think it's a bad idea. It's especially a bad idea in a place like Syria or Iraq, where you have a 5-6-sided conflict. Messy, totally messy. And I think the U.S. this is why the rationale for U.S. involvement keeps changing, in part because the facts on the ground keep changing, but also because you insert yourself and then you realize, oh, we have this other problem and this is not a reliable ally, so we have to do something else. And so the rationale begins to change in order to sell it.
I'd really like to honor our time as good as possible, so you can continue asking questions online or also in our local audience, write them down. And John, I think you will be able to answer them later in a written form, and we will post them on our website. But I want to conclude today in thanking John for his presentation and invite Professor Harry Anastasiou from Portland State University, who is also a founding officer of the Rotarian Action Group for Peace, to give us some concluding remarks. Professor Anastasiou is a Cypriot American social and political scientist, a recognized pioneer in peace-building initiatives in Cyprus, Greece, Turkey, the Middle East, and the European Union. He's a leading faculty member in our conflict resolution program, and a longtime Rotarian and academic advisor to the Rotary Peace Centers Committee, and simply a very recognized scholar in our field of peace and conflict studies, and we're very happy that he's also a friend of the War Prevention Initiative. So Harry, if you would like to conclude this event for us.
So thank you very much, Patrick, for the introduction. But indeed, thank you, John, for your presentation. Obviously, when it comes to summarizing a presentation as challenging and as complex as the one that John gave us today, one is confronted with a considerable task. But I will do my best to at least outline the highlights of John's talk, just to remind ourselves of what we heard and also to help in digesting these very challenging information that he put forward. Obviously, the focus of his talk was on the phenomenon of militarism. And of course, one way to understand militarism is it's a human attitude, it's an approach to things, and it's also the precursor for warfare. John started by identifying militarism as a toxic phenomenon. And as with all toxic phenomena, we have to know something about it so as to minimize the contamination and the toxicity that this could produce in approaching and handling phenomena around militarism. John also posed a great challenge to the prevalent belief in progress, namely the idea that humanity goes from good to better, and at some point, all human problems will be resolved somehow. John posed a great challenge here by noting that human history is not linear, and that we may have progress, but we may also have regress in human history. He drew attention, of course, to the paralysis that sometimes the system creates because it is so big, and it tends to defeat those who want change. But John reminded us very, very clearly that human agency and the fact that humans can be creative and can induce change is really central to the challenge he put forward. He made reference to the 2008 Global en route strategy, the white paper that attempts to design a global projection of military power on the part of the US around the world. He also noted that there was opposition to this by the Union of American States. Then he went on to talk about the various forms of militarism. He identified 4 areas: the area of training, the area of operations, which comes down to actual warfare, to assistance and to sales of military equipment. He also made reference to the fact that how problematic it often is for the US to put boots on the ground. And that because of that reaction, especially at home, there is also the tendency for the US to expand its military presence by working through proxy governments overseas. And in this context, both military assistance and sales play a huge role. John also reminded us that the phenomenon of militarism also has a cultural dimension, and that belief systems and values, the way they operate within culture, can in fact promote militaristic attitudes. He made reference to films that out of the top 11 films he mentioned, 9 of them that really had high records in making money were focused on militaristic themes. So he stressed the fact that militarism is also embedded in culture, and there we have another challenge. He then turned to the phenomenon of the state, which appears to be one of the main agencies of entrenching and spreading militarism. And he noted that one of the generally acceptable features of the state is that the state monopolizes violence. It's the only institution that apparently has the legitimacy to use violence. And this, again, John noted, promotes a militaristic concept of the state. In this context, he also mentioned the extraordinary expenditures that we see on the part of the United States in the military. He noted that the total spending budget of the US is equivalent to the next 8 countries around the world, 5 of which are US allies. He talked about discretionary spending on the military, how 54% of all discretionary spending goes onto the military. And then, of course, he raised the question of what it means to be a civilian in an attempt to distinguish the military from civilian. And that's when things became somewhat blurred. I think the point that he underscored is that militarism often tends to blur the distinction between the civilian and military. And in the same regard, it also blurs the distinction between law enforcement and warfare. He made a digression to American exceptionalism and the idea that within that framework we have the notion that the US has to act as a global policeman. And in that context, again, the difference between law enforcement and warfare becomes very, very blurred. He talked also about research. And he also noted that his research around military contracts brought forward some very interesting facts. He noted that a lot of the contracts that have to do with the military are really focused on rendering the US quite independent from other countries by way of enabling the US to project power globally in a manner that is autonomous, in a manner that doesn't depend at all on other states, or at least depends as little as possible on other states. The next topic that John talked about had to do with the environment and the environmental cost that is tied up with militarism. He talked about the phenomenon of contamination, not only via warfare itself, but also via training for the military. He noted that while there are some measures of accountability within the country, when it comes to the international arena, there is very little accountability regarding the pollution that results from warfare and training for warfare, because there is just no mechanism of international monitoring that can bring forward accountability for the polluters. He also talked about the environmental challenge vis-à-vis fossil fuel dependency and made the important point that by reorienting military spending, it is really possible to reduce the fossil fuel footprint. Then he went into the area of assistance and noted that foreign aid and assistance is really mediated more through the Pentagon and Pentagon activity as well as Pentagon policy formation. In this context, he talked about partnerships with other countries and who the partners are. And again, he made reference to American exceptionalism and the idea that the position of the US in the world also helps differentiate the good guys from the bad guys. And of course, by making that differentiation, the presumption is that you arm the good guys and you train the good guys in order to defeat the bad guys. But rightly so, John noted that in this approach there is often what is called blowback, namely that you train a group or a country in your weaponry, you assume that they're an ally, and at some point something happens and it takes a historical turn, and those weapons either find themselves in an adversary or people themselves who have been trained and equipped by the US shift their position. So that becomes a very volatile and very slippery slope as far as providing security through assistance. And of course, there is also, he noted, the issue of self-interest, which leads to enormous sales of weaponry. Usually, the process, he notes, starts with assistantship, where the US, equips and gives military assistance to other governments. And thereafter, this process turns into a selling process by which the US sells its weapons to various governments around the world. John also challenged certain assumptions. He noted that generally the peace community believes that the more military aid one gives to a country or the more military injection you have in a conflict situation, the worse things become. This assumption stands in direct opposition to the militarist belief that all you need to do is to use military power to cap a situation, to control a situation, to provide security, and once you do that, things develop as normal. He really challenged that assumption by pointing to the complications that emerged with the military aid to Colombia and the use of military force in that country. He made reference to the so-called false positives. He also talked about Mexico, the drug in Mexico, and noted this enormous ambiguity of how the US is arming both sides, the cartels, through commercial flow of weapons into Mexico, and how the government is arming the state. In closing, I have to stress, and I have to commend John for his challenge, but these are also challenges that I think have a huge bearing on democratic societies. And I cannot help but recall a statistic about democratic societies and warfare, which really stunned me when I came across it. And that is the fact that democratic societies have been more engaged in warfare. They engage in warfare far more frequently than non-democratic societies. And of course, it raises the question as to why is that so? Is it perhaps that democracies have not addressed the phenomenon of militarism sufficiently enough? Or have they legitimized the phenomenon of militarism on some moral high ground? I think these are very significant questions that I think John leaves us with as we reflect on what he said. And I think overall he really poses a challenge as to how we can bring militarism under democratic control and democratic monitoring, which again points to the challenge that democracies face today. In closing, I would like to just pose a question and perhaps a challenge, because in my mind I often wonder whether the challenge to minimize war and to annihilate and hopefully eliminate militarism, which is the precursor of war, is perhaps one of the biggest challenges within democracies, and perhaps one of the biggest challenges for civilization. I often wonder whether ending war is not really the final challenge of civilization. Thank you.
And I think Professor Anastasio gave us a little teaser of an upcoming webcast lecture we're going to have here later this year featuring him. That might be your topic there. We haven't decided that yet. But with this, we conclude. And thank you, everyone here in the room. And thank you, everyone online watching. Have a good day.